Okay, so hopefully before you're watching this, you have set up your page 14 in your notebook. And at the top of page 14, it should say Nile River Graphic Organizer in that white space. And then, of course, in the bottom right-hand corner, it should have a number 14. So I'm going to go through and read this to you, and I'm going to try to use this underlining tool to, I'm not going to let me do that. So I'm just going to Okay, so I've got the underlining tool ready. So I will underline what needs to be written in your graphic organizer. So if you haven't set it up yet, pause me, go back and click on the document that shows you how to set up your graphic organizer and then come back. Otherwise, this is not going to be very easy for you to use if you don't already have your graphic organizer set up. But assuming that you do, we will proceed. So I'm going to be working in the upper left-hand box first, which you should have labeled People of the River, which matches this title. And there's going to be two facts that we're going to get from this paragraph right here that you're looking at on the screen. So it starts with, we know that the Mesopotamians controlled the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to grow crops. They developed the technology to do so, but the unpredictable rivers constantly challenged them. So we want to write that down. And by them, we mean Mesopotamians. So we really want to substitute the word them and put in Mesopotamians. So your first number underneath People of the River will say unpredictable rivers constantly challenged the Mesopotamians. Okay, pause me if you need to write that down, but I'm going to keep moving. The second bullet point is going to be this one. In Egypt, however, the flooding of the Nile River was seasonal and consistent from year to year, so the Egyptians did not face the same challenge. So I would just write, in Egypt, flooding of the Nile was seasonal and consistent from year to year. So that part is going to be your fact number 2. And now I'm going to move on to the upper right-hand box, which is predictable floods. Okay, so now we're on the upper right-hand corner, predictable floods. As in Mesopotamia, flooding along the Nile in Egypt was common. The Nile floods, however, were more predictable and less destructive than those of the Tigris and Euphrates. So this is going to be our first fact under predictable floods. We're going to put the Nile floods were more predictable and less destructive than those of the Tigris and Euphrates. So again, pause me and write that down, and then press play when you want to do number 2, but I'm going to keep moving. Egyptians were not afraid of destruction. So there we go, right here is number 2. So they were not afraid of specific destruction. You'd want to put this sentence for number 2. Egyptians were not afraid that heavy floods would destroy their homes and crops. So Mesopotamians knew that when the Tigris and Euphrates flooded, if they didn't try to do something about it, their homes were going to be washed away and their crops were going to be lost. The Egyptians didn't have that big of an issue because the Nile didn't flood so drastically. So they were able to kind of prepare for it. It was predictable, and they were able to keep their homes and crops safe as long as they kept up with knowing what season was which season and how that was going to affect the river, which they did. They learned pretty quickly that that's what was going to happen. So here's what was going to happen. So this is number 3 now that you're listening for. Each year during late spring, heavy tropical rains in Central Africa and melting mountain snow in Eastern Africa added water to the Nile. So this is where the extra water comes from. So this is what I wrote down to make it easy. I wrote during late spring, and then I just wrote heavy rains. So during late spring, heavy rains and melting mountain snow. We don't really necessarily need to remember which parts of Africa this is happening in. Added water to the Nile. So your third fact will say, during late spring, heavy rains and melting mountain snow added water to the Nile. Now we're on to the fourth one. Around the middle of summer, the Nile overflowed its banks and flooded the land. So we're just going to put middle of summer. The Nile overflowed and flooded the land. And the last one, number 5 for this box. Egyptian farmers were ready to take advantage of this cycle. When the waters returned to their normal levels, this is going to be number 5, this whole line. So once the water receded, right, that means to go back into the normal part of the river instead of all over the land. What the water left behind was this almost magical soil, and that's the word silt from your previous vocabulary words. So this soil is now super fertile and super going to do a great job with the next round of crops they plant. So even though this is a pain, right, the water comes in, they have to sort of deal with it. And once it goes back, though, their crops are ready to go into the ground in some really amazing, very fertile soil. Okay, we're going to move in the bottom left now. How did the Egyptians farm? Okay, farmers planted wheat, barley, and flax seeds while the soil was still wet. So that's going to be our first fact under the bottom left box of our graphic organizer, which is called How Did the Egyptians Farm? Over time, they grew enough food to feed themselves and the animals they raised. So this is going to be our second fact. And this is important if you're a farmer because you have to obviously be able to feed your animals as well. And I'm not talking about pets, I'm talking about livestock and animals that were going to be used for food and clothing. During the dry season, Egyptian farmers irrigated their crops. They scooped out basins or bowl-shaped holes in the earth to store river water. They then dug canals that extended from the basins to the fields, allowing water to flow to their crops. So this is a picture of a man using a tool, which we're going to get to down here, to scoop up water, and then he's going to take it back to the basin, the bowl that he dug in, the hole that he dug in the earth to store the water, and then he'll make a canal that will take that water from the basin that he dug to his crops. So we are on number 3, and we're going to write about the dry season. So during the dry season, Egyptian farmers irrigated their crops, and then all I want to write is they dug canals from the basins to the fields. So that's all going to be number 3. Mine is kind of tight in there in my notes, but make it happen. Number 4 under there is going to be this word, the shadoof. This is the tool that you're looking at right here. And all you're going to write is this. Shadoof is a bucket attached to a long pole that lifts water from the Nile and empties it into the basin. So it could hold a lot of water as opposed to just like 1 cup at a time. Number 5, we're going to talk about floods. Okay, so when floods washed away boundary markers, farmers used geometry. Actually, I'm sorry. Nope, this is going to be number 6. You just want to have, for number 5, floods washed away boundary markers. Okay, so right here. Okay, this one. When floods washed away boundary markers, that's number 5. And then this is number 6. Farmers used geometry to help them recalculate where one field began and the other ended. Okay, now we're on number 7, and that's the last one, and that's going to be papyrus. So papyrus is a plant, called a reed plant, that grew wild along the Nile. And then you're going to want to add, that's fact number 7 that I just showed you, this one. Papyrus, a reed plant that grew wild along the Nile, and you just want to add made paper. That's all number 7. Papyrus, a reed plant that grew wild along the Nile, made paper. And this is the world's first paper, which is really cool. Okay, now we're going to be on the last box. How did the Egyptians write? We'll talk more about papyrus over here. Let me get out of here. All right. Okay, so we're going to be on the bottom right-hand corner in just a second, but before that, I just want you to look at this part so you can just see how paper was made, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it's kind of it's a really cool process. So they would take this plant and cut it into sort of ribbons and soak it into water, and then the strips were laid like a basket weave style. So they would lay one piece out going up and down, and then another piece out going left to right, and then another piece going up and down until they made what looked like a piece of paper, but it was sort of laid on top of each other in strips. And then they pounded it and would squeeze all the liquid out until it was stuck together and then dry it so that it would make a large piece of papyrus. So you can see a little image in the right there, but it was a really cool process and they still do it just, for special occasion type of paper. Egyptian kids, if you were to visit an Egyptian middle school, they have notebook paper just like you do. But as part of their culture, this is just a cool thing that still grows. Like the reed plant still grows along the Nile and it's used to make sandals and baskets and all kinds of stuff. But of course, paper was its original really cool use. Okay, so for the last box of your graphic organizer in the bottom right-hand corner, how did the Egyptians write? You want to write that they, right here, this will be your first one, they developed their own writing system. I guess my little red pen got really skinny there. See if we can make it a little bit bigger. Here we go. Okay, so that's your first fact. And then you want to write at first, Egyptian writing was made up of picture symbols. So that's the first sort of evolution of how the writing happened. So first it's every picture equals a concept or a phrase or something like that. It then develops into a more complex writing system, which is going to be hieroglyphics. So the combination of pictures and sound symbols created hieroglyphics. So this is going to be your number 3. And even though this is a really cool writing system and it's, one of the first in the world after cuneiform, most people didn't know how to read or write it. So few ancient Egyptians could read or write hieroglyphics. So this is going to be number 4. So if you were specially trained to go to scribe school, then you would be one of the few lucky ones that knew how to do it. But for the most part, most folks did not. They would hire a scribe when they needed something written down. But we do want to know that when the scribes did write, they wrote on papyrus. So that's your 5th fact and final fact, and your graphic organizer is now done. So if you missed anything, just to review, I'm going to go from the upper left-hand corner again. People of the river, that box should have 2 facts. Predictable floods should have 5. How did the Egyptians farm should have 7. And how did the Egyptians write should have 5. And you can go back and rewatch any part of this that you need to make sure that you got all of those facts. All right. Have a good day.